It's like we say that there are five senses. There's the sense of touch, there's a sense of smell, taste, hearing, and sight. What are we going to do with speech? Is speech really not a sense? Now, I think many people are going to say, no, it's not. So, what do we do with speech? Is speech natural? I think that it is. Is speech learned from others? I think that it is. Can something be both natural and learned from others? Sure. It just means that we're naturally social. Okay. The question becomes, how does speech relate to both perceptual process and conceptual process? Here's what I think happens. It's sort of like this. People seem to think that our perceptions go out into the world and we have access to the world through the various perceptual processes. Admittedly, these are abstractive. That is, when you touch, there's a sort of spatiotemporal abstracting, and sight has a perspective, and sound has an optimal distance. I mean, there's all sorts of abstractive characteristics in the way that we access what's there. But I think we want to believe, or we seem to say anyway, that we get this pure perception. I think it's like what William James would call the buzzing, blooming confusion of perceptual process. And then from that, conceptual process carves out objects, makes discrete entities, uses classification schemes, creates categories that then place things within categories. I call this a pen, or I call this an object. You know, those are different ways of conceptualizing the same perceptual immediacy. What happens then is when people ask about language, they say, well, where does language and speech fit into that? I think, for the most part, people seem to align it with the conceptualization process. And part of that, I think, makes sense. It does seem as if speech, you know, and this is Suzanne Langer, you know, she says that in some way, language is conception, and conception is the frame of perception. There's so much about that that I agree with and I think is right. But could there be a totally different way to come at it? I think a totally different way to come at it would be, how do we experience time? And is time perceived or conceived? Is time interpreted? See, Royce would say that time is interpreted, not just conceived or perceived. But maybe we could suggest, just for argument's sake, could it be that speech is an intersubjective sense of time? That is, we don't just use language to conceive time, like categories of things like the past or the present or the future. I don't just talk about tomorrow or talk about, you know, the months ahead. There certainly is that, and I do create concepts through calendars and through awareness of clocks and things like this. But I think we could also suggest that the grammar within speech, that all speech has a kind of grammar, and the grammar of tense, of mood, of, you know, the difference between the imperfect past and the future conditional, these kinds of grammatical tenses, they're less explicit concepts that we have for referencing entities, quotes, in the future or in the past, as much as the way that we perceive time. Now, someone would say, well, how is it a perception? I think I would say it this way, that in the same way that a bat has echolocation and it emits sounds that it uses to navigate through an environment by sort of bouncing off of things that are there and then, you know, moving accordingly, I think humans, with others as they communicate, we use speech as a kind of intersubjective echolocation, partly because what we're bouncing off of isn't just things there in the environment, but we're bouncing off of possibilities that are projected with others. That is, others can be a place and moment in the future that I can anticipate because we can coordinate our behavior through speech. That is, time is opened in a perceptual and conceptual way, right? It's not just conceptual, right? There's a perceptual future that's opened to us. That is, we're actually moving toward it in a perceptual way. It's not just speculative, like we're thinking about it. We're orienting toward it in a kind of praxis. And I think the more that people would understand speech as an intersubjective sense of time, that time is made articulate through speech, and we end up somewhere as a result of the way we're talking. I think if people could understand that, we could really get at the way that language is constitutive rather than simply representational in a very robust way. See, I think, unfortunately, this notion that language is constitutive or that language has consequences, it's been caught up in this postmodernist discourse as if attacking representationalism is a spooky attempt to say that there is no truth. No, I think the point is that language is consequential, meaning it's not just we're using labels to refer to things that are existing in space. We're navigating to and co-creating a future. Speech allows us with others to somehow move toward a future in a very meaningful way. And in that sense, I think we may be misunderstanding what speech is if we think that there are just simply perceptual processes in a sort of in an environmental now, and then conceptual processes of a kind of grid that gets laid on top of that, because I think concepts have a kind of timelessness. Once we would see speech as an intersubjective sense of time, and we see that language cuts into both conceptual and perceptual awareness of temporal flow and temporal order, I think we have a whole new vista for trying to understand what speech is and what language is. Thanks.